What would you do if the person who trusted you the least had the power to destroy your entire reputation with a single word? Imagine giving years of loyalty, honesty, and hard work only to be labeled a thief in front of strangers. Have you ever been through something like that, when the truth is on your side, but no one believes you? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. In a quiet neighborhood just outside Atlanta, the wealthy often live behind. Tall gates and perfectly manicured lawns. From the outside, their lives look flawless. Expensive cars in the driveway, lavish parties on the weekends, and homes filled with treasures most people only see in magazines. Inside one of these mansions lives Richard, a man whose fortune is as grand as his ego. He is known for his extravagant lifestyle and his obsession with appearances. To Richard, reputation is everything. But behind his polished smile lies a cold arrogance that few dare to confront. And then there's Sarah. She's not part of Richard's world of wealth and luxury. She's a single mother working long hours as a maid, doing everything she can to provide for her young son. Sarah walks into that mansion every day, carrying not only her cleaning supplies, but also the weight of her family's hopes. Her honesty and humility shine through in everything she does. For years, she has dusted those shelves, polished those floors, and cared for that house as if it were her own, never once giving reason for anyone to doubt her character. But in a single moment, everything changes. Richard claims that a piece of valuable jewelry has gone missing. Without hesitation, without evidence, and without mercy, he points the finger at Sarah. His voice echoes through the marble hallways, filled with outrage and accusation. "She stole it," he says with certainty, and just like that, a loyal maid becomes a suspect, a thief in the eyes of the man she served faithfully for years. Can you imagine the humiliation, the fear of being accused when you know you've done nothing wrong? Sarah's hands tremble as her son watches, eyes wide with confusion. She pleads her innocence, but Richard doesn't listen. To him, the word of a wealthy man carries more weight than the truth of a struggling single mother. The tension grows heavier when the police are called. The flashing lights outside the mansion draw curious stares from neighbors. Inside, Sarah feels her world collapsing as officers step through the grand entrance. Richard stands tall, confident that his accusations will be enough to condemn her. In his mind, the outcome is already decided, but what he doesn't know, what he could never predict, is that the truth has a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected moments. This is not just a story about wealth and poverty. It's about power, injustice, and the courage it takes to stand tall when the world wants to bring you down. It's about how appearances can deceive and how arrogance can blind a man to the consequences of his own actions. Have you ever noticed how the people who scream the loudest about honesty are sometimes the ones hiding the darkest secrets? Sarah's voice may tremble, but her heart knows the truth. And soon, everyone else will know it too. Because when the police begin their investigation, the spotlight shifts. What begins as a humiliating accusation will unravel into a revelation that shocks not only the officers in that room, but everyone. Watching this story unfold, stay with me, because what comes next will change everything you think you know about justice, power, and truth. The moment of revelation is closer than you think, and the mansion's walls are about to echo with a truth no amount of wealth can silence. And maybe, as you hear this unfolding, you can feel a little of Sarah's fear, the weight of being accused when all you've ever carried with you is honesty. Have you ever been in a situation where you were blamed for something you didn't do? Or maybe you've seen someone else go through that moment of injustice, powerless to defend themselves. If this stirs something inside you, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story, your feelings, even just a few words. They make this space more than just a channel. They turn it into a community where voices that are often silenced finally get heard. And if this kind of story resonates with you, If you find value in exploring these lessons of power, truth, and resilience, then don't forget to tap the like button. It might seem like a small action, but it's what helps this message travel further, reaching more people who may need to hear that they are not alone when facing injustice. Subscribing is another way to stay close, almost like saying, "Yes, I want to walk through more of these stories with you." It means you won't miss the next chapter, the next twist, or the next lesson that can quietly shift the way we see the world. Your support is what allows this channel to keep growing and bringing forward stories that matter, stories that cut deeper than entertainment and remind us of our shared humanity. So, if this moment has touched something within you, let your voice join in, whether through a comment, a like, or by subscribing. Together, we carry these stories further. And now, as the officers step deeper into the mansion, the air thick with suspicion and pride, something is about to surface that will turn Richard's certainty into doubt and Sarah's trembling silence into undeniable truth. Richard Parker was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even stepped into it, not because of kindness or warmth, but because of the way he carried himself. Chin slightly raised, eyes sharp and calculating, his tailored suit always pressed to perfection. In Atlanta's wealthiest circles, his name meant power, money, and influence. He had built his empire in real estate, turning small neighborhoods into towering developments and suburban blocks into profitable investments. On paper, he was the definition of success. Yet behind the polished smile and the impressive net worth, there was a man obsessed with control, someone who measured every interaction through the lens of reputation and status. To Richard, life was a competition. Every handshake, every dinner party, every business deal. It wasn't about connection, it was about winning. The mansion he lived in wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of pride, designed to remind everyone who visited of just how untouchable he was. Marble floors reflected the chandeliers like mirrors, artwork imported from Europe lined the walls, and cars worth more than most people's homes sat idle in his garage. And yet, beneath all that luxury, there was a hollowness, an emptiness that no expensive purchase could truly hide. Perception is everything, Richard often told his associates. It doesn't matter what you do behind the scenes, as long as the world believes you're untouchable. That phrase alone revealed his mindset, not one built on authenticity, but on illusion. His wealth was more than a cushion, it was armor, protecting him from ever being questioned, ever being doubted, ever being held accountable. But his cold demeanor made others uneasy, even at charity events, where the wealthy gathered to show their generosity. Richard's smile never quite reached his eyes. He would shake hands, pose for photographs, and donate large checks. But there was always calculation behind it. He wasn't giving, he was investing in reputation, in influence, in the ability to silence whispers before they became scandals. Those who worked for him understood this side of Richard all too well. The staff in his mansion walked carefully, aware that a misplaced object or a slight delay could trigger his wrath. He didn't shout often, but when he did, his words cut sharper than a blade. "Do I pay you to make mistakes?" he once barked at a gardener who trimmed a hedge unevenly. "Details matter. If you can't get the little things right, you'll never handle the big ones." For Richard, everything was about precision and perfection, but not in pursuit of beauty or excellence, in pursuit of control. This obsession with control spilled into every corner of his life. Business partners admired his ruthless efficiency but feared his temper. Friends, or those who pretended to be, knew that betrayal was not forgiven but crushed under legal threats or financial retaliation. Even his family, those closest to him, felt the sting of his dominance. Conversations at the dinner table were less about connection and more about appearances. "Sit up straight," he would tell his daughter. "Don't laugh so loud," he'd scold his wife in public. Everything had to align with the image he curated. And yet, despite all his success, Richard was never truly at peace. He constantly scanned for threats, not just financial or legal, but personal. He was haunted by the idea that someone might see through his carefully constructed facade. This paranoia made him suspicious, quick to judge, and even quicker to accuse. When a glass went missing from the dining room, he suspected the staff before considering it had been misplaced. If a business partner questioned him, he interpreted it as betrayal rather than collaboration. Richard lived with the belief that the world was either under his control or against him, and he preferred the former. His relationship with Sarah, the maid, was no different. To him, she wasn't a person with struggles, a mother with dreams. She was an employee, a background figure in his stage play of wealth. He rarely looked her in the eyes, rarely thanked her for her work, and never asked about her life. Yet he expected perfection from her, as he did from everyone. When guests visited, Richard made sure the mansion sparkled, not because he appreciated Sarah's dedication, but because he knew appearances could never falter. What made Richard so unnerving was not just his arrogance, but the way he justified it. "People respect strength," he once told a colleague. "Compassion is weakness. If you want to stay on top, you never let them see you bleed." That was his creed. Cold, calculated, unwavering. But in that very belief, he revealed the cracks in his armor, because what he didn't realize, what people blinded by power often forget, is that arrogance blinds you to your own vulnerabilities. Behind closed doors, Richard's decisions weren't always as spotless as his image. Financial pressures, risky investments, and private indulgences created a trail he worked hard to cover up. He relied on his reputation as a shield, convinced that no one would dare to question him. To the outside world, he was flawless, but behind the scenes, shadows grew darker each day. And it was this mix of pride, paranoia, and hidden truth that made him dangerous. Because when something went wrong, when even the smallest detail fell out of place, Richard needed someone else to blame. His empire couldn't show weakness, and his ego couldn't handle fault. Someone had to pay the price, and it was never going to be him. That's why the moment he claimed his jewelry was missing, suspicion didn't fall on him, it fell on Sarah. In his eyes, accusing her wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. He needed the world to see that if anything was out of place, it wasn't his fault. It couldn't be. And so, with cold certainty, Richard pointed the finger at the one person in the mansion who had no defense against his power. He stood tall in that living room, the air thick with tension, his words sharp and deliberate. "She stole it," he declared, his voice steady, unshaken, as though the mere force of his conviction could turn a lie into truth. To Richard, this wasn't just about missing jewelry, it was about control, about maintaining the illusion that he was above suspicion. But in his confidence, he overlooked something crucial. The very arrogance that made him powerful would become the crack in his armor, because while Richard believed he was untouchable, the truth had already begun to unravel, slowly, quietly, in places he never thought to look. And as the police prepared to step into that mansion, his carefully constructed world of power and ego stood closer than ever to being exposed. Sarah Miller's mornings always began before the sun rose over the skyline of Atlanta. In a modest apartment on the edge of the city, she would quietly move through the kitchen, making a simple breakfast for her young son, Ethan. Their lives were far from luxurious, but Sarah's love wrapped around him like the warmest blanket. She carried in her eyes a quiet resilience, the kind you only find in those who have learned to endure life's storms without letting them extinguish their light. Every day was a journey between two worlds. One, the small apartment with second-hand furniture, toys stacked neatly against the wall, and the comforting smell of coffee that reminded her of home. The other, a sprawling mansion filled with marble floors and gold-framed mirrors, where she worked tirelessly to keep everything immaculate. For Sarah, stepping into Richard Parker's house wasn't just a job, it was a mindset shift, a constant reminder of the sharp contrast between humility and arrogance, need and excess, humanity, and ego. She had been working for Richard for nearly 7 years. During that time, she had dusted every surface, scrubbed every tile, and polished every chandelier until they gleamed. She knew the mansion better than anyone, better even than Richard himself. She knew which door hinges creaked, which windows stuck on humid days, and which corners of the vast halls collected the most dust. Yet despite her dedication, she remained invisible in Richard's world. Her honesty, though, was undeniable. People in her community often spoke of her integrity, the way she would rather go without than take what wasn't hers. Neighbors trusted her with their spare keys, friends leaned on her when times were hard, and Ethan adored her for the small but meaningful moments she created, reading to him at night, packing his lunch with handwritten notes, and whispering encouragement before he went to school. But in Richard's eyes, she was just another employee. He never stopped to notice how her shoes were worn thin from years of walking, or how her hands carried tiny scars from cleaning chemicals. He never asked about Ethan, never cared about the woman behind the uniform. For him, Sarah was simply part of the background, someone who kept the illusion of perfection alive in his grand mansion. And yet, it was that very invisibility that made Sarah so strong. Her humility wasn't weakness, it was power disguised. She had learned to find pride in her work, not because Richard demanded it, but because her values demanded it. She carried herself with dignity, even in the face of condescension. A clean home means peace of mind, she often told Ethan, and peace of mind is something money can't buy. Her story was one of transformation, though not the kind that came with wealth or luxury. It was the quiet transformation of character, the journey of someone who chose kindness over bitterness, resilience over surrender. Behind the scenes of her daily labor, Sarah was building something far more valuable than riches. She was building trust, credibility, and an unshakable moral foundation. The irony was striking. Richard, who had everything, was constantly consumed by fear of losing control. Sarah, who had so little, carried herself with a calm certainty that could not be bought. This contrast was not just financial, it was emotional, spiritual, a revelation of two mindsets colliding in the same space. When she walked through the vast hallways with her cleaning supplies, Sarah never envied the luxury around her. Instead, she thought of the impact of her decisions, the lessons she wanted Ethan to carry into his future. She taught him that humility was not about lowering yourself, but about standing tall without arrogance. She wanted him to understand that dignity could exist even when your bank account was empty. Richard's arrogance often collided with her quiet presence. He would sometimes bark orders without looking up from his phone, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Make sure the dining room sparkles before the guests arrive," he'd say, as though she didn't already know. Sarah would respond softly, "Yes, Mr. Parker," and continue her work without complaint. Her voice never carried resentment, only discipline and determination. At night, when she returned home exhausted, Ethan would ask, "Mum, do they treat you nice there?" Sarah would smile, tired but tender. "Sometimes people forget to see others, Ethan, but we don't forget who we are, right?" And Ethan, with the innocence of a child, would nod firmly. "Right, Mom." That was her hidden truth, the strength of knowing. Her worth even when others refused to see it. It wasn't the praise of Richard or anyone else that gave her value. It was the knowledge that she was honest, that she was providing for her son, and that she was walking a path of integrity. Years of loyal service built a rhythm to her life. Mondays meant laundry stacked high in the mansion's back room. Wednesdays meant polishing the silverware before Richard's business dinners. Fridays often ended with Sarah sneaking home just in time to catch Ethan's school recital or game, her heart swelling with pride despite her exhaustion. This routine was not glamorous, but it was steady. It was survival wrapped in devotion. Sarah never once imagined that loyalty could turn against her. She believed that honesty was always enough, that her years of service had earned her at least the benefit of the doubt. But the universe has a way of testing even the strongest spirits, and Sarah's test was about to come in the most humiliating way. The day Richard's jewelry went missing, Sarah's world shifted in an instant. His cold voice, filled with certainty, cut through the mansion like a blade. "It was her," he declared. "She's the only one who could have done it." In that moment, all her years of dedication seemed to vanish, erased by one man's arrogance. Her hands shook, her heart pounded, and her mind raced with disbelief. "I would never steal, Mr. Parker," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the accusation. But Richard didn't look at her with curiosity or compassion. He looked at her as though she were already guilty. Ethan's face flashed in her thoughts, his trusting eyes, his faith in her honesty. That memory was the anchor that kept her from collapsing under the pressure. She couldn't let despair win. She had to stand, even when the world seemed determined to push her down. Injustice has a particular sting when it's directed at those who least deserve it. And for Sarah, this was more than an accusation. It was an attempt to strip her of the dignity she had fought to preserve. Yet what Richard didn't know, what his arrogance blinded him from seeing, was that truth has a way of rising. It doesn't matter how powerful the accuser is, lies cannot bury honesty forever. And so, as Sarah stood in that grand living room, facing the weight of Richard's words, she carried something far greater than fear. She carried the quiet resilience of a woman who knew that hidden beneath the humiliation of the moment was a revelation waiting to surface, one that would transform not only her life, but the balance of power inside that mansion. The accusation began with something so small it almost felt ridiculous. A velvet jewelry case left open on the marble vanity, a sliver of doubt slicing through a morning that had started like any other. Richard stood in his master suite with the certainty of a judge and the poise of a man who believed he could never be wrong. He pinched the edge of the empty case between two fingers, as if even touching it might soil him. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room not for evidence, but for someone to carry the blame. For him, the missing sapphires were not just about money. They were about control, image, power. It was a mindset he had refined to a cruel edge. When something goes missing, order must be restored, and that begins with pointing a finger. Downstairs, Sarah finished polishing the dining room table, her reflection flickering across the glossy surface as she wiped away the last fingerprints from last night's dinner. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who knew every rhythm of the house, the way sunlight crept across the floors in the late morning, the way the front door latch stuck if you turned it too quickly, the way silence felt heavy just before Richard entered a room. She did not know that upstairs a storm had already formed, a decision taking shape, not an honest search for truth, but a swift assignment of guilt. "Where is it?" Richard's voice cut through the hallway like a glass shattering on tile. He didn't shout often, but when he did, it carried the kind of force that made people stop breathing. He strode down the steps, the velvet case clenched in his fist. "Where is the sapphire set that was in this?" Sarah looked up, startled, a cloth folded in her hand. "I don't know, Mr. Parker. I haven't been in your room this morning. I was assigned to the living—" "Don't lie to me!" he snapped, the words crisp and cold. "You cleaned the landing. You dusted the hallway mirrors. You knew I was out for a call. You could have walked in and no one would have seen." "I would never walk into your room without permission," Sarah said, her voice steady but small. "I would never take anything from you. I don't steal." Richard turned to the butler, James, who stood uncertainly near the base of the staircase. "Call the staff," he ordered. "All of them. Now." There was no request in his tone, only verdict. Within minutes, the team gathered in the foyer. James, with his dignified posture shaken by worry. Elena from the kitchen, hands still floured from rolling pastry. Miguel from the grounds, dirt under his fingernails from planting spring azaleas. Sarah stood among them, the uniform that had always made her invisible, now making her a target. Richard held up the empty case as if it were a piece of damning evidence. "This is missing," he said, measured and theatrical, a performance meant for impact. A sapphire. Necklace and earrings. They were in my room last night. This morning, gone. Only the staff have access to the house in these hours. James cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Parker, perhaps they were moved to the safe. Sometimes you secure valuables before— I know where my own things are, Richard said, the rebuke sharp. He looked past James, focusing on Sarah as if drawn by some internal compass that always pointed to the least powerful person in the room. You were on this floor yesterday. Afternoon. I dusted the second-floor hallway and the reading nook, Sarah replied, her voice thinner now. I did not enter your room, sir. Convenient, Richard said. Very convenient that you can say that now. Mr. Parker, Eleanor tried, her accent soft but firm. Sarah has been here years. She's never— Enough, he said, slicing off the defense with a glance that warned of consequences. We'll settle this properly. He turned to Sarah. Open your bag. The request didn't feel like a request. It felt like a spotlight burning her skin. Sarah swallowed, cheeks flushing with a mixture of shock and humiliation, then knelt to open the canvas tote she carried to and from work. Inside, a wallet with a few worn bills, a notebook with Ethan's homework schedule, a container with her lunch, rice, chicken, carrots, wrapped carefully in foil, and an extra pair of latex gloves. She placed each item on the entry table with a trembling care, aware of how everyone's eyes followed her hands. I didn't take anything, she said, voice catching on the last word. I know what this looks like, but I didn't. Richard stepped forward, scanning the items with a clinical detachment, as if the sincerity in her face were irrelevant data. People who steal, he said coolly, rarely think they look like thieves. James shifted, the tension pressing on his posture. Sir, may I suggest we review the home surveillance? The hallway cameras? The hallway camera outside my room is under maintenance. As you well know, Richard replied, eyes flicking to him. And isn't that convenient? His gaze returned to Sarah, as though the universe had presented him the perfect alignment of suspicion and opportunity. Sarah's mind rushed to Ethan, his backpack, his cereal bowl, the note she had tucked into his lunchbox that morning. You are brave and kind. Don't forget who you are. She felt the words steady her breath. I didn't do this, she said more firmly. I wouldn't do this. My son— Your son is not relevant here, Richard cut in, the temperature of the room dropping. This is my house, my valuables, my rules. The humiliation was a slow burn across her cheeks. Elena's hands twisted in her apron. Miguel kept his eyes on the floor. The foyer seemed to stretch and harden, the chandeliers above reflecting a fractured image of everyone present, like distorted versions of themselves trapped in glass. Behind the scenes of the accusation, something else tightened. The way power bends reality. The way one man's certainty can turn a room into a courtroom without a judge. I have worked for you for 7 years, Sarah said softly. You know me. I know results, Richard said. And what I see is that something is missing, and someone here took it. Decisions don't make themselves. Someone chose to do this. It wasn't me, Sarah said. Please. Richard's jaw flexed. He seemed to taste the power of the moment. It was not enough to declare his loss. He needed a culprit. In his world, responsibility flowed downhill. The hidden truth, though, what no one could see yet, was that his certainty masked the quiet tremor of something else, a piece of his carefully arranged story that didn't quite fit. But arrogance has a way of smoothing over contradictions, of convincing itself that doubt is disloyalty. James, Richard said at last, call the police. A ripple went through the staff. Elena's breath hitched. Miguel looked up, startled. Sarah's legs felt unsteady. Please don't do this, she whispered. I have never stolen anything in my life. If you let me, I'll help you search every room, every drawer. We will not tear apart my house because you're uncomfortable with accountability, Richard said. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. That old sentence, the one used to shame the powerless, landed hard. But Sarah stood her ground, even as her body shook. I fear humiliation, she said, tears swelling but not falling. I fear being treated like a criminal in front of people who know me. I fear what my son will think if I'm taken away for something I didn't do. You should have thought about your son before taking what wasn't yours, Richard replied, ice forming on each word. The foyer clock ticked too loudly, the sound exaggerating the space between seconds. James, torn between duty and conscience, stepped aside to make the call. His voice was steady, professional. He gave the address, stated the situation, used precise words that left no room for the messiness of emotion. When he hung up, the silence that followed felt like the intake of breath before a verdict. The staff drifted back toward their stations, not out of indifference but survival. No one wanted to appear loyal to the accused under Richard's gaze. Sarah gathered the few items from her bag, fingers clumsy, and replaced them, as if restoring order might restore her dignity. She stood with her shoulders set, the transformation of a person who refuses to let shame be the final word. Richard paced, the case still in his hand like a token he could not let go of. He reviewed out loud the timeline, last night's dinner, the guests, the moment he remembered seeing the sapphire set on the vanity. His version of events was neat, trimmed of any uncertainty. It made a story where he was the victim and she was the explanation. What he did not say, what no one in the room knew to ask, was where he had been between midnight and dawn, what decisions he had made in the solitude of his study, what small slips can occur when a man believes he is invisible to consequences. "Mr. Parker," James said carefully, "is it possible the jewelry was moved to your briefcase or the safe? You had the investment call last night." Richard's eyes flashed. "Are you suggesting I misplace my own property?" "No, sir," James said quietly. "Only that under pressure. Anyone can—" "Anyone but me," Richard finished, as if stamping a seal on the conversation. Sarah watched him, and something shifted. Inside her, an understanding that this wasn't just about jewels. It was about the impact of power misused, the journey of a lie gathering momentum, the way a person at the top can make decisions that change the course of someone else's life without feeling the weight of it. She thought of Ethan again, of the lessons she taught him about truth and courage, about how to hold still in storms. She inhaled slowly. "I didn't do this," she said once more, not pleading this time, but asserting. "I will. Say it again and again because it's the truth." He stared at her with a calm that felt more dangerous than anger. "We'll see what the officers think." The minutes lengthened. Out front, the magnolia leaves whispered against the stone steps. A delivery truck rumbled past, indifferent to the drama unfolding behind the iron gate. Even the light in the foyer seemed to change, bright at the edges, dim at the center, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Behind the scenes of the accusation, tiny details waited to become revelations. A smudge on a drawer handle, a timestamp on a security panel, an inconsistency in Richard's recollection he hadn't noticed yet. But those fragments remained quiet, biding their time. Elena emerged from the kitchen and pressed a glass of water into Sarah's hands. "Drink," she murmured, a brief act of defiance against the script that had been imposed on them. Sarah nodded, grateful, the kindness reminding her that not everyone in this house had traded compassion for fear. The front door opened briefly as a gust of air moved through, carrying with it the faint buzz of a city that goes on no matter who is breaking apart. Sarah caught her reflection in the glass. Tired, yes, and shaken, but also standing upright. "I'm not a thief," she told herself under her breath, almost like a prayer. "I'm not." From the doorway of his study, Richard watched with the gaze of a man who believed the moment belonged to him. "You will wait in the foyer," he said. "When the police arrive, you will answer their questions." "I will," Sarah said, steady, despite the tremor in her fingers. "I have nothing to hide." The words floated between them like a challenge, neither of them fully understood yet. Because in houses like Richard's, where appearances ruled and fear enforced them, the truth had a way of feeling out of place, until it didn't. And when truth finally decided to speak, it often did so in ways that changed every assumption, rebuilding the narrative from the ground up. In the distance, a low hum began to form, barely noticeable at first. The sound of tires, the murmur of radios, the churn of an engine turning onto the private road that led to the mansion. The sound would grow, and with it, the boundaries of the story would shift. Sarah stood a little taller, the glass of water cool in her palm, and Richard tightened his grip on the velvet case, as if holding it could still make his version of events the only one that mattered. The morning. Light crept across the floor, inching toward the threshold, where the next movement of this unfolding drama was about to cross into the room. The first sign of their arrival wasn't the siren, but the scattered flicker of red and blue sliding across the magnolia leaves outside, then washing over the foyer's marble in restless strokes of light. The iron gate whispered as it parted, and a cruiser rolled up the drive with a second one right behind it, heavy and deliberate, the sound of engines settling into a low idle that seemed to press against the windows. Richard adjusted his cufflinks as though the moment were a gala, not a reckoning. Sarah stood very still, the glass of water cool and shaking in her hand, trying to slow the tremor that kept rising from her chest to her fingertips like a tide she couldn't command. She could feel Ethan's face in her thoughts, wide eyes, the way he said, "Mom," when he was scared, and the memory steadied her the way a hand on your shoulder can steady. Your balance. The door opened to two uniformed officers who stepped into the foyer with the practiced calm of people trained to see everything and react only when it mattered. Officer Daniels, tall and composed, scanned the room with a glance that missed nothing. Officer Ruiz, with a notebook already in hand, gave the kind of simple nod that can either soothe or warn. They smelled faintly of rain and street dust, bringing the outside world crashing into a house that tried very hard to keep it at bay. "Good morning," Daniel said, voice even. "We're responding to a call regarding missing property." Richard stepped forward, posture immaculate. "Officer, thank you for coming. A sapphire necklace and earrings, quite valuable, were in my master suite last night. This morning they're gone." Ruiz looked up from her notes. "And your name, sir?" "Richard Parker," he said, letting the syllables sit in the air like credentials. He didn't need to add what he owned or who he knew. His tone did it for him. "And who had access to the home in the relevant time window?" Daniels asked. "My household staff," Richard replied, already turning slightly so the officer's gaze would land on Sarah. "They were on duty. She was closest." His hand cut the air with surgical precision. "Sarah Miller!" Sarah swallowed. "I was cleaning the dining room and hallway yesterday. I didn't go into his bedroom. I didn't take anything." Ruiz's expression remained neutral. "Ms. Miller, we'll talk to everyone. For now, could we start with a basic timeline?" Richard didn't wait to be invited. "We had guests last night for dinner, 2 investors and their wives. I placed the jewelry on my vanity before the event. This morning I checked the case. Empty. The butler can confirm no guests were upstairs after dinner. The staff is present now. I'd like this handled quickly and discreetly." Daniels gave the room another slow sweep, clocking the staff by the staircase. The butler's careful stance, the subtle way everyone breathed around Richard. "We'll do our best, sir, but thorough takes precedence over fast." Richard's smile was polite and blade thin. "I have no objection to a thorough search." He held that line with the satisfaction of a man who confused compliance with righteousness. "I also request that Ms. Miller's belongings be examined immediately." The words landed with weight. Sarah's fingers tightened around the glass until a soft click warned it might crack. She set it down gently and folded her hands as if to keep them from telling on her fear. Her phone lit up in her bag, and a small photo of Ethan flashed across the screen. Gap-toothed smile from last summer by the Chattahoochee River. Sunlight caught in his hair. For a split second, the image became his worried face in her mind, the way he looks when she's late picking him up. She exhaled slowly, silently. "I am not what he says I am." "We'll get to searches in due order," Daniel said, measured. "First, we establish facts." He gestured to James. "Sir, you're the butler." "Yes," James said. "James Gray, I oversee the house staff. Were the upstairs quarters restricted during or after the dinner?" "Yes. No guests were permitted past the landing. I verified doors were closed and the hallway secured. Cameras? Ruiz asked, pen ready. James hesitated and glanced at Richard. There is a hallway camera just outside the master suite. It's been under maintenance since last week. Ruiz scribbled. Convenient, she murmured. Not unkindly, not accusing, just noting. Any other cameras covering access points to the second floor? Stairwell and main foyer, James said. The feeds record to a local server in Mr. Parker's study. Daniels nodded. We'll review them. Mr. Parker, we'll also need a list of last night's guests and service providers. Anyone in the home within the last 24 hours. Richard's jaw hardened at the idea his circle might be subject to scrutiny. If it helps, of course. The words were cooperative. The tone resented the premise. The officers' presence changed the atmosphere. Their uniforms didn't just bring authority, they brought process. Procedure has a way of flattening theatrics. Where Richard wanted a scene that ended with a confession and applause for his decisiveness, the officers began a methodical journey. Questions, timestamps, verifications, decisions based on evidence rather than posture. That shift introduced a new kind of suspense, quieter than a shout, but more powerful. The suspense of hidden truth inching toward light. Ms. Miller, Ruiz said, turning slightly to face her, how long have you worked here? 7 years, Sarah said. I clean, organize, and manage linens. I don't enter Mr. Parker's bedroom without instruction. Were you on the second floor yesterday? In the hallway and reading nook, not in his bedroom. She forced her voice to remain steady. I would not go in there without permission. I would not take anything that isn't mine. Richard's eyes narrowed, his expression a cold smirk that said he'd already rendered judgment and now waited for the system to catch up. With respect, officer, we can save time. Her bag was already checked informally. I'd like a formal search. Daniels lifted a hand. Sir, we'll decide the sequence. He turned back to Sarah. Ms. Miller, are you willing to voluntarily consent to a search of your belongings? You have the right to decline. Sarah inhaled, hearing the echo of Ethan's voice reading, from a school poster about courage. I consent, she said quietly. I have nothing to hide. Richard's lips parted in something like triumph. He expected this moment to reduce her, a televised humiliation without cameras. But consent, spoken with dignity, isn't surrender. It's a decision, and decisions shape the arc of a story. Ruiz donned gloves, and Sarah placed her tote on the entry table. The items emerged one by one under careful hands. The battered wallet, the lunch container, the notebook. With Ethan's practice schedule, a small pencil drawing he'd made of the two of them standing under a tree with the word home printed above their heads. Ruiz paused at the drawing, then kept going. Gloves, a compact umbrella, a small bottle of hand lotion, nothing that glittered, nothing that whispered sapphire. She checked seams and pockets, not to embarrass, but to be thorough. When she finished, she glanced at Daniels and shook her head once. There's nothing here, Daniels said. Matter of fact. He looked to Richard. We'll also need to examine your room, including the vanity, jewelry case, and any safes. Richard blinked, as if the script had a line he hadn't anticipated. My room? That's where the item was last seen, Daniels replied. We started the scene. A faint crack appeared in Richard's composure, hairline but real. He recovered with a close-lipped smile. Very well, this way. As they moved toward the staircase, the house seemed to listen. The staff remained. At their edges, professional invisibility taking on a new texture, hope restrained by fear. Sarah stayed near the foyer as instructed, but the sound of each footstep on the treads reached her like a slow metronome. She rubbed her thumb over the corner of Ethan's drawing, the paper soft with fingerprints. You're okay, Mom? She whispered under her breath, as if answering a question only he could ask. Upstairs, the master suite opened like a showroom. Clean lines, expensive quiet. Daniels and Ruiz moved with calm discipline, cataloguing the placement of objects, noting a faint scuff by the vanity's leg, the silk scarf draped too neatly over a chair, the jewelry case lying open as if posed for a photograph. Ruiz checked the hinges. Daniels examined the lock. "Does this latch fully?" he asked. "It should," Richard said. "I leave it open when I'm deciding on a piece." "Any signs of forced entry?" Ruiz asked. "None visible," Daniels said, crouching to look under the vanity, then at the edge of the rug. He turned to Richard. "Do you keep an inventory of valuables?" "In my head," Richard said, too quickly. Ruiz wrote that down because speed is sometimes more revealing than content. "Safe access?" "In the closet," Richard replied, gesturing. "Biometric. Only I can open it." "May we see?" Daniels asked. Richard held up a palm. "Is that necessary? The missing items weren't in the safe." "It helps us establish scope," Daniels said. "Sometimes people relocate items under stress and forget." "They did." Richard's eyes cooled by a few degrees. He placed his hand on the scanner and the safe clicked open. Inside sat a few documents, a cufflink case, a watch that could have purchased a small condo. No sapphires. Ruiz checked serial numbers. Daniels logged the visible items, and they both made no comment because silence is a tool. When you want the room to say things to you, it doesn't know it's saying. Back downstairs, Sarah waited, listening to the ceiling like it could translate the future. James stood a respectful distance away. "Would you like to sit?" he asked. "I'd rather stand," she said. Standing felt like remembering who she was. She thought of transformation, not the kind that wealth buys, but the kind that pain forges. How a person decides who they are when someone tries to write their name in a language of shame. "I didn't do this," she repeated softly, not to persuade anyone this time, but to keep her own center. From the top of the stairs, footsteps returned. Daniels descended first, followed by Ruiz, both officers wearing the expression of people who have collected pieces but not yet placed the puzzle. Richard came last, straight-backed, as if gravity had been told not to bother him. "We'll need to review your security footage from the past 24 hours, Daniels said. "Stairwell and foyer at a minimum. Also, any exterior cameras covering the back entrance and driveway." "The server is in my study," Richard replied. "I'll have James bring up the console." "I'll access it," Ruiz said. "Please show me the way." They moved toward the study, and Sarah caught a glimpse of Richard's profile as he passed. Clean jawline, the self-satisfied tilt of someone who believes the world is a stage set designed in his favor. His eyes flicked to her with that same cold smirk, as if to say, "This ends the way I say it ends." She felt a faint quake of fear, but beneath it a stronger current. Mindset, the decision to keep telling the truth the same way you keep breathing. In the study, the hum of electronics made a thin, steady sound under the officer's questions. Ruiz slid into the chair at the desk and began navigating the console with the ease of someone who's spent too many hours in small rooms watching big mistakes. Daniels stood behind her, gaze tracking the timestamps. They pulled up the foyer feed from the night before. Guests arriving, laughter pinned to expensive coats, a caterer passing with a tray, staff moving along the edges like choreography. Ruiz scrubbed forward. The investors left, coats reclaimed by a gloved hand, doors closing with a soft hush. The house exhaled, then the overnight footage, the stillness of wealth sleeping. At 2:11 a.m., a flicker, motion at the base of the stairs, a figure crossing the foyer toward the hall. The camera angle caught only a shoulder and the curve of a sleeve. The rest was lost to a column and glare. "Rewind, frame by frame," Daniels said. Ruiz did. The shoulder again, the sleeve, and expensive charcoal, a flash of a watch face catching the foyer light, then gone. "Staff uniforms are navy," James offered from the doorway. "None of us wear watches on shift." Ruiz kept her face neutral. "Timestamps confirmed?" "Synced to network clock," James said. "Do you recognize this, Mr. Parker?" Daniels asked. Richard let out a soft chuckle that sounded rehearsed. "Officer, that could be anyone. We had guests. Perhaps someone returned for a forgotten item. Perhaps a neighbor." "Do your neighbors let themselves into your home at 2 a.m.? Daniels asked calmly. Richard's smile thinned. "You're looking at shadows." "Shadows have edges," Ruiz said, barely above a whisper, focused on the screen. Sometimes the edge is where the truth begins. They exported the clip to a drive and logged it. Ruiz flipped to the stairwell camera, scanning the time span around 2:11. A flicker there, too. Less clear, more suggestion than shape. But the foyer clip was enough to bend the air in the study. It wasn't proof, it was direction. Direction changes stories. Outside, another cruiser idled, the presence public now, neighbors slowing as they drove by, curiosity pressing against the iron gate as if it could see through. Inside, Stephanie from laundry pretended to fold fresh towels in the hall to feel useful. Miguel busied himself near the back door, eyes cutting to the driveway more often than his plants required. Elena wiped a spotless counter, then wiped it again, whispering a small prayer. No one would hear. Behind the scenes, a house that lived by order felt the tremor of uncertainty moving through its beams. "Miss Miller," Daniel said as they returned to the foyer, "thank you for your cooperation. We're going to continue reviewing footage and speaking with staff. For now, please remain available." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said. Her hands had stopped shaking. She didn't mistake the pause in pressure for safety. She just recognized a different kind of moment, the one where the story, so sure of its path, discovers a bend in the road. Richard shifted his weight, and for a breath his mask cracked, a half-second of irritation at not being the one directing every line. He recovered quickly, smoothing his expression back into civility. "Will there be a formal search of the premises?" he asked, voice clipped at the edges. "Yes," Daniel said, "starting with the path of access to the master suite. We'll also need to speak to your guests." "My guests are not suspects," Richard replied, the word guests wrapped in velvet. "Neither is anyone until we have cause," Daniel said. "That includes Ms. Miller." Sarah met Richard's eyes and held them, not to challenge, but to exist without shrinking. "I told the truth," she said, mostly to herself, but the space accepted the words as if the walls could keep them safe. Ruiz lifted the small drive with the exported clip. "We'll review this in detail," she said, already turning toward the console again. "There are always small things people miss when they're sure of the big picture." The air felt different now, less like a stage and more like a lab. Suspense didn't shout. It hummed, a low current that pulled attention to corners, to timelines, to choices made in the quiet hours when appearances were off-duty. The mansion's polished surfaces reflected everyone smaller than they felt, reminders that even grand spaces can't stretch around the truth forever. The journey had entered a new stretch of road, one where the certainty of a cold smirk might have to compete with the precision of evidence. A decision was forming, not in the mouth of the man who loved decisions, but in the slow assembly of facts that don't ask permission to be what they are. From the driveway came the closing of a car door, then the soft murmur of radio chatter. Daniels moved toward the study again, and Ruiz followed, carrying the clip that could become a question powerful enough to alter the narrative. Sarah turned the folded drawing between her fingers, feeling the paper's edge like a small anchor. In the upstairs hall, the light shifted by an inch, reaching for the top stair. And all at once, the house felt as if it were leaning toward the place where the next answer might be hiding, ready to be found. The foyer, usually silent and echoing only the sound of polished shoes across marble, had turned into a theater of tension. The officer's methodical presence filled the space, every small movement sounding louder than it should. Ruiz's gloves still held the faintest trace of Sarah's belongings, carefully examined and returned with the kind of precision that leaves no doubt. The tote sat there again, unzipped and innocent, its contents exactly as they had been before. A notebook smudged from constant use, Ethan's drawing folded at the edges, a lunch that smelled faintly of home. It was an ordinary bag, belonging to an ordinary woman, and the ordinariness itself was its defense. Nothing stolen, nothing hidden, nothing to convict. Yet Richard's face betrayed a flicker of irritation that he could not mask quickly enough. His jaw shifted once, sharp at the corner, then froze again into practiced confidence. He stood straighter, as if posture alone could restore the illusion of certainty. "You've been thorough," he said, his voice wrapped in a false patience that barely disguised its edge. "But perhaps not thorough enough. People who steal don't always keep what they've taken in their bags. You'll have to search more carefully. The rooms, the staff quarters, anywhere she's had access." Daniels lifted his eyes from his notepad, calm and unhurried. "Mr. Parker, we search based on evidence, not pressure. Ms. Miller's belongings were clean. That's fact." His tone was even, but it carried a quiet authority that refused to bend to Richard's urgency. Richard smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, only stretched the lips like a line drawn across glass. "With respect, officer, it's naive to think someone clever enough to steal would leave it in plain sight. I run businesses. I know how people operate behind the scenes. If you dig deeper, you'll find what you're looking for." Sarah's hands, though still trembling, slowly folded together in front of her. She stood tall, though she felt the sting of humiliation burn her cheeks. The word naive hung in the air, not aimed at her directly, but falling over her like a shadow. She thought of Ethan again, the way he'd once asked, "Mom, why do people say bad things about others when they don't even know them?" And how she had answered, "Because sometimes their hearts are clouded, but truth always clears the sky." That thought anchored her now. Ruiz stepped closer, her eyes calm, her voice deliberate. "Ms. Miller, thank you for your cooperation. Nothing in your possession connects you to this alleged theft. You've been transparent, and that matters." But Richard's impatience cracked through again. "Alleged," he repeated, his tone clipped. "Something is missing. That's not alleged, it's fact. And the only logical explanation is that someone in this house took it. It doesn't vanish into thin air. You have procedures, I understand, but let's not waste time dancing around the obvious. This is a matter of accountability." Daniels tilted his head, studying Richard more closely than before. "And accountability applies to everyone, sir, including owners, including guests. We don't carve exceptions." The words shifted something in the air, subtle but undeniable. Richard's brows tightened for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, spreading his arms with a mock openness. "Search whatever you like. My conscience is clean. But don't allow appearances of innocence to blind you. She's the one with motive. Do you know how much I pay her? To someone like her, those jewels are worth years of salary. Temptation is powerful." Sarah flinched, the words cutting deeper than the accusation itself. "I am not tempted by what is not mine," she said, her voice firmer than before. "I may not have much, but I have integrity. My son knows me as honest, and I will not let him believe otherwise." The staff along the hallway shifted uneasily, not daring to intervene, but unable to mask their discomfort. Miguel stared at the floor as if it could offer him cover. Elena twisted her hands in her apron, whispering a prayer under her breath. James, the butler, stood stiff, his jaw tight, the weight of loyalty to his employer colliding with the sight of injustice unfolding in front of him. Ruiz turned her gaze back to Richard. "You mentioned value. Can you provide us with receipts or documentation for the jewelry? An insurance record, perhaps?" "Of course," Richard said, the answer sharp and quick like a sword pulled from its sheath. "I keep files for everything. But what does paperwork prove? It doesn't tell you who touched it last." "It helps us understand what we're looking for," Daniel said. "And it helps establish patterns. Sometimes items are misplaced. Sometimes claims don't match reality. Facts matter more than assumptions." The word misplaced made Richard stiffen, his smile twitching into something tighter. "I assure you, officer, I don't misplace property of that value. My house runs on order." Sarah listened, heart pounding, every word of the exchange pressing down like a weight. It wasn't just the accusation anymore. It was the way Richard turned her into a symbol of temptation, the way he stripped her dignity with subtle knives of language. She wasn't only fighting for her innocence, she was fighting against the mindset that wealth equaled truth and poverty equaled guilt. The investigation pressed forward, each step deliberate. Daniels asked for access to the guest list from the dinner. Ruiz requested timestamps of staff rotations the night before. James provided answers with steady precision, though his voice carried a strain that betrayed his unease. The second hidden truth shimmered beneath the surface, not yet revealed, but tugging at the edges like a thread waiting to unravel. Richard grew restless, his impatience feeding on itself. He paced the foyer, the case still in his hand, tapping it against his palm as though rhythm could create certainty. "You're wasting precious time," he muttered. "Every minute that passes is another minute the thief could have hidden or even disposed of the jewels. Don't you see the impact? Don't you see the urgency?" Daniels remained unshaken. "We see the need for accuracy. Rushed decisions compromise justice, and justice requires precision." That word, justice, hung heavy in the air. Sarah felt it settle inside her like a quiet promise whispered from somewhere beyond her reach. Justice. The very thing Richard believed he controlled, the very thing he tried to bend with his authority, might soon find its own voice. Richard turned, his eyes locking on Sarah once more, cold and unyielding. "If you're innocent, why do you look so nervous?" "Because I am being accused of something I didn't do," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Because my name is being dragged through the mud in front of people I've served faithfully for years. Nervousness is not guilt. It's fear of losing what I've built, my reputation, my dignity, my ability to provide for my son." For the first time, Richard blinked, taken aback not by her words, but by the steadiness with which she delivered them. The arrogance in his smirk faltered, if only for a breath, before he masked it again with disdain. "Touching," he said flatly. The officers exchanged a glance, unspoken communication passing between them. Ruiz wrote another line in her notebook, her pen pausing briefly as if to underline the shift in tone. Daniels closed his notepad with a soft snap. "We're expanding the scope of our search," Daniels said. "All areas of the house will be checked. Staff quarters, guest rooms, the master suite again. We'll also collect security footage for the last 48 hours, not just 24. And Mr. Parker, we'll need that documentation on the jewelry immediately." The command in his voice left no room for negotiation, no cracks for Richard's ego to slip through. For the first time that morning, Richard wasn't directing the narrative. He was part of it, subject to it, bound by it. Sarah exhaled slowly, the weight of injustice still heavy, but now tempered by something else. Momentum. The journey wasn't finished, and the hidden truth hadn't surfaced yet, but the investigation was no longer circling her like a predator. It was widening, expanding, and with every step it took, the illusion Richard had built began to show its first fractures. The chandeliers above swayed slightly, not from wind, but from footsteps moving steadily across the floors. Officers charting paths of questions that would inevitably lead somewhere Richard never wanted them to go. And in the stillness between their movements, the mansion itself seemed to lean forward, listening, waiting for the revelations that were bound to come. What shifted the room wasn't louder voices or bigger gestures, but a small, almost forgettable detail that didn't fit where it had been placed. In the study, the security console hummed softly, a patient machine that didn't care about wealth or pride. Ruiz leaned in, scrolling past the foyer feed to a system menu most homeowners never bothered to learn. She clicked into a log labeled "Device Status and Overrides," the kind of behind-the-scenes report that quietly records decisions people assume vanish with a screen's glow. A row of entries lined up in tidy, time-stamped lines. Most were routine, motion events, door sensors, arming and disarming cycles. Then a line in a different shade. Cam Toof Mr. Hall, disabled, manual override. The timestamp read 01:57 a.m. The user ID field didn't say service. It didn't say system. It said admin. Ruiz tapped the screen. "Who has the admin login to your security system, Mr. Parker?" Richard didn't miss a beat. "The installer, myself, possibly the butler for scheduling updates." He offered the last part like a crumb thrown over his shoulder. James, from the doorway, steadied his voice. I don't have the admin credentials, sir, only the ability to arm and disarm when you are traveling. And the installer? Daniels asked. They're not on site at 2 a.m., Ruiz said, her tone flat, reading the next line that marched in at 2:34 a.m. Cam 2F Mester Hall, enabled, manual override. She let the silence do the arithmetic. Disable at 1:57, a figure in the foyer at 2:11, re-enable at 2:34. The pattern drew itself, not a clean confession, patterns rarely are, but a contour, an outline of decisions made when the house was supposed to be sleeping. This is interesting, Ruiz added, not as accusation but as an invitation for the room to notice what it had been trained not to see. Richard exhaled through his nose. A restrained show of annoyance. I told you the hallway camera has been under maintenance. That's why it reads as manual. The technician likely logged in remotely. Technicians leave notes, Daniel said. Where's the service ticket? James moved toward a leather folder on the credenza. The last ticket was from last week, he said. Daytime. The tech signed the paper and I countersigned. He opened the folder, found the carbon copy, passed it carefully to Ruiz, who scanned the date. It was 9 days ago, mid-afternoon, not last night, not even close. May we also see your alarm history? Daniels asked. Door and safe access. Richard's jaw tightened a fraction. If you think this is a game of gotcha, you'll be disappointed. You're wasting time on peripherals. Daniels didn't answer. He knew from experience that the smallest switches often cast the longest shadows. He navigated to entry-exit logs. The system listed each access point in a clean, impartial column. Front door, disarmed. 5:58 p.m. Rear service door, opened for catering, 6:10 p.m., closed 6:23 p.m. Upstairs master, door contact opened 2:08 a.m., closed 2:09 a.m. Closet 2:09, safe proximity sensor 2:10, all tagged to an active account state, disarmed by user admin. The neutral font did not gloat, it simply printed what had happened. Your system shows your suite and closet accessed around 2 in the morning, Daniel said, voice steady, eyes now on Richard rather than the screen. Earlier you said you saw the jewelry on the vanity before dinner. You also implied you didn't go upstairs again until this morning. Help me align those timelines. Richard's smile was thin. I took a call after midnight. I may have gone up for a moment to get papers from the closet safe. I meet clients who operate in multiple time zones. It's not unusual. At 2:10 in the morning? Ruiz asked. With your hallway camera turned off for 27 minutes. I don't manage cameras, Richard said. I manage assets. If the system glitched, that's not my concern, unless it allowed someone to steal from me. Ruiz didn't argue, she kept scrolling. In the system notes footer, a faint line showed a browser login from Office iMac, user R. Parker at 1:56 a.m., followed by Live View, Hall, Error, Device Offline, and then Settings, Camera Disable. Not definitive on its own, but like breadcrumbs, even small crumbs lead somewhere if you keep walking. While the study drew the officers deeper into the system's memory, another thread tugged in the dressing room. Daniel stepped back into the master suite with a lighter touch than before, and let his eyes drift, not hunting for sapphires. That kind of search turns clumsy, but for the one thing that didn't behave like the others. He crouched by the vanity. The open velvet case sat like a stage prop. He lifted it and turned it gently. A faint oval imprint pressed into the velvet lining suggested the necklace had rested there recently. Yes, but the pressure ring was a shade that looked older than last night, the indent softened by time rather than fresh. He set it down and slid open a drawer. Lined trays, nothing remarkable. Another drawer stuck slightly halfway out, catching on something. He wiggled it free and found the back edge snagging a folded slip of paper wedged at the rail. He pinched it out and unfolded it. It wasn't a pawn slip, it wasn't obviously incriminating, but it was real in the way small truths are. Northside Jewelry and Loan. Appraisal. Inquiry. Received. The date was 2 weeks earlier. A note in unfamiliar handwriting read, Owner prefers discreet counter-visit. Call ahead. A phone number sat underlined. A second tiny scribble, blue stones, keep estimate under insurance threshold. The paper had the faint sheen of a receipt that's been carried and refolded. "Mr. Parker," Daniels called, voice calm. "Why would your name appear on an appraisal inquiry for blue stones at a loan and jewelry shop?" Richard didn't step toward the paper. He stepped away. "I have many assets reviewed for insurance. That's routine. You'll find inquiries for watches, art, other pieces." Daniels held the slip in 2 fingers. "This note asks to keep the estimate under an insurance threshold. That's not typical if you're increasing coverage. It is typical if you don't want a policy to flag a change." Richard smoothed his tie as if that could smooth the moment. "You're reading innuendo into business. Those shops haggle. Everyone wants a leverage. Sometimes the thing that reveals a mind isn't what it hides, but how it explains." Daniels didn't press. He moved to the closet again, tracing the molding with his palm. The safe he'd been shown sat square and official, but above it a section of paneling showed a hairline gap, just enough to suggest it had been removed and reset. He tapped it with a knuckle, hollow. He tried the edge. It resisted, then shifted with a barely audible click as a magnetic catch gave way. Behind the panel sat a narrow secondary lockbox, the kind designers build for people who like to stage layers of privacy. An inner room inside a locked room. The box bore no brand label, just a numeric pad. Daniels raised an eyebrow toward Richard. "That's for documents," Richard said smoothly. "Family trust papers, no jewelry." "Open it," Daniels said. Richard's pause was the length of a heartbeat, no longer, but in a house trained to hear subtext, it sounded like a bell. He entered a code. The box clicked. Inside lay a passport, 2 envelopes bound with a rubber band, a small USB drive, and a cloth pouch the size of a folded handkerchief. Daniels didn't reach for the pouch first. He noted its presence, then lifted one envelope. It held photocopies of insurance declarations, policy riders on valuables. One rider showed a temporary removal from premises note dated 3 days ago, a clause sometimes used when pieces are out for cleaning or appraisal. The destination line was blank. Ruiz, entering, set the security printout on the dresser and glanced at the open lockbox. Daniels nodded toward the pouch. She opened it with gloved care. No sapphires spilled out. Instead, a fine dust of blue lint clung to the cloth's inner seam, the kind you see when fabric rubs against stones and prongs in a hurry. Ruiz looked at Richard, then at Daniels. No one used the word obvious. In real investigations, the obvious is always a collection of small, patient things. Downstairs, Sarah couldn't see any of this. She stood where she'd been told, holding Ethan's drawing like a lifeline. Her breath found a rhythm that matched neither panic nor calm, a midpoint where people live when they choose dignity in the middle of doubt. "I didn't do this," she said once, low, more to the floor than to anyone else. James heard anyway. "I know," he answered, not as a declaration but as a quiet loyalty that took courage to express under those chandeliers. Ruiz returned to the study and slid into the chair again. She pulled the foyer clip back on screen, slow-motioned the figure, stopped at the frame where the watch face caught the light. She enlarged the section. The clarity didn't turn it into a billboard, but the dial had a distinct arrangement. 3 subdials clustered tight, a bezel with a unique count. She glanced at the safe inventory they'd noted upstairs. The watch in the safe had a different bezel. Ruiz didn't make a speech. She noted it. Then she opened the console mail tab. The browser had been left logged in. She wouldn't ordinarily poke without permission, but Daniel's nod and Richard's consent to cooperate covered the review. There, pinned at the top, an email from an insurance broker timestamped 6:42 a.m. "Regarding your jewelry rider, interim questions." The broker wrote in careful corporate wording that the temporary removal clause needed documentation within 48 hours to avoid lapse. Another email below it, older, read, "Appraisal appointment, confirmed Tuesday, 10 a.m. The subject listed the same shop from the folded slip. "Officer," Richard said, bristling. "My correspondence is privileged. This is bordering on harassment. Your consent extends to materials relevant to the claim you made," Daniel said. "You asked us to find the truth about the missing property. That's what we're doing." "What you're doing," Richard said, "is twisting routine business into implication." Ruiz clicked one more tab. System user management. The last password change for admin occurred 3 days ago. The user, R. Parker. She printed the logs, not as a verdict, but as a map. Maps change how people travel through a story. The search widened as ordered, not because Richard demanded it, but because the facts asked it to. Staff quarters were checked respectfully, guest rooms recorded and cleared, linen closets and service corridors opened. No sapphires appeared. The weight of injustice, which had been pressing squarely on Sarah's shoulders, began to shift, not vanishing. It never vanishes quickly, but redistributing across the room, as if the air had signed a new contract. Miguel found his courage enough to murmur when no one else could hear, "You don't deserve this." And Sarah answered, "Thank you," not with relief, but with gratitude for small human decency. Daniels returned to the master and, with Richard's permission, examined the vanity more closely. A faint smear near the back edge caught the light at an angle, the kind of mark made when metal meets finish in haste. He photographed it. He looked under the vanity again, this time letting his flashlight trace the skirting board. A fine thread of blue fabric lay snagged on a nailhead, thin as a whisper. He bagged it without comment. If you build your life on appearances, even the lint tells a story. Meanwhile, Ruiz asked for the guest list. 2 investors from Buckhead, their spouses, a junior associate, catering staff, a driver. She ran her finger down the list like she was reading a casting call, and then noted, almost incidentally, that one investor owned a controlling stake in a luxury pawn chain. It meant nothing yet, or it meant everything. Not every revelation is a shout. Some sit politely in the second paragraph and wait for a question to call them by name. When Richard re-entered the study, he did so with the poise of a man used to reclaiming rooms. "You've torn through my home," he said, controlled. "You've put a hard-working staff through indignity, and still you have. Nothing but speculation. Ms. Miller had the access and the motive. You're letting sentiment cloud a simple theft." Daniels's answer was not theatrical. "We have an alarm log that places a user in your suite and closet between 2 and 2:10 a.m., a manual camera override during the same window, an email confirming an appraisal, a rider noting temporary removal, and a secondary lockbox containing residue consistent with blue gemstones. We also have a staff member whose belongings show no connection to the property. Our job is not to pick the easiest story. It's to follow the one the facts right, even if the handwriting is slow." Sarah didn't hear those words. She heard only the cadence of voices, the movement of feet, the sense that the house itself was exhaling something it had held too long. She pressed the crease in Ethan's drawing and said, softer now, to the air and maybe to him, "I'm coming home to you." It wasn't a promise about time. It was a promise about who she would be when she did. In the corridor, Elena wiped an already clean picture frame and whispered, "Let truth stand, the way some people light a candle." James adjusted a cuff and looked toward the study door, every inch of his posture saying what he could not say aloud. And Miguel, passing by the mudroom, noticed a pair of men's dress shoes set on a mat. Sleek, dark, their soles dusted with a fine grit that didn't belong to the manicured driveway. He paused, frowned, then kept moving. Later, that grit would matter. Later, someone would ask where that grit came from and why it matched a back alley 2 blocks from a north side storefront. But for now, it sat quietly, a detail waiting for its turn. The mansion had always been Richard's stage, the place where he controlled light and lines. But stages can also be laboratories, and laboratories demand evidence. The mindset that had once dictated the script now confronted a different genre, one where revelations arrive not as grand speeches, but as converging lines on a page. If Sarah didn't take it, who did? The question was no longer whispered. It vibrated through the house like the low sound of a distant train. It didn't call for outrage. It called for patience, for the discipline of letting the next piece click into place. Ruiz lifted the USB drive from the lockbox and held it up. "We'll need to examine this," she said. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, his decisions looping back on him in tight circles. Daniels photographed the panel gap and replaced it, his movements careful, respectful of walls and of truths. Down the hall, the light shifted again, inching toward mid-morning, and footsteps set out along a new path, the one that would trace the shape already hinted at in logs and dust and emails, the shape of a story that had decided to stop pretending it was something else. The house, once pulsing with Richard's authority, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of the security console and the occasional creak of polished wood beneath the officer's careful steps. Richard tried to steady the narrative with his voice, but each explanation he offered seemed thinner, as if stretched too far over cracks that could no longer be hidden. He smoothed his tie again, the gesture more compulsive than controlled, and glanced at the foyer where Sarah still stood, her presence a reminder of the accusation he'd staged like a performance. But performances unravel when the audience sees the strings. Ruiz slid the USB drive into her field laptop, her fingers tapping with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 100 times before. The screen came alive with file folders, PDFs of insurance riders, scanned receipts, and a set of photographs. She opened one, and the pixels filled with the unmistakable sapphire necklace gleaming under a jeweler's inspection lamp. Another photograph followed, this time the necklace laid on a felt tray at Northside Jewelry and Loan, the shop's logo faint in the corner of the frame. A date stamp marked it, 3 days ago, 10:15 a.m. The metadata confirmed location services from a device tagged R. Parker. It was not a shadow, not a rumor, but a fact frozen in digital light. Daniels leaned in, his voice even but edged with clarity. "Mr. Parker, can you explain why there are photographs of your jewelry at a pawn establishment taken earlier this week?" Richard's mask faltered. He blinked, once, too slowly. "Those were insurance. Appraisals," he said. "Standard business. You're twisting context." Ruiz clicked to the next folder. A scanned receipt appeared. Header, crisp, Northside Jewelry and Loan, transaction record. The description read, "Sapphire necklace and earrings. Appraised value $128,000. The line at the bottom read, "Pawn loan issued $75,000. Collateral to be held until redeemed." Signed, R. Parker. The silence in the room thickened, the kind that makes even the smallest breath sound like thunder. Sarah's knees softened for a moment, but she locked them in place, her dignity refusing to collapse. James, the butler, inhaled sharply, as though air itself had betrayed him. Elena froze in the hallway, her hands still dusted with flour from the kitchen. Miguel, standing by the back door, whispered under his breath, "Dios mío!" Daniels straightened, the document glowing faintly on the laptop screen. "This isn't insurance. This is a pawn loan, and your signature is right here." Richard's voice strained to find its usual command, but cracked under its own weight. "It's a temporary measure. Liquidity, strategic financing, wealth management requires flexibility. It's all very sophisticated, beyond what you—" Ruiz cut in, calm but cutting. "Beyond what we understand, or beyond what you want us to see, because what this shows is not sophistication, it shows desperation, and desperation explains why you'd invent a theft." The transformation of the room was almost physical, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to witness the revelation. Sarah felt her chest rise, the tight coil of fear loosening into something else. Not triumph, not yet, but the steady relief of being seen. She whispered almost to herself, "I told you, I didn't take it." Her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than she thought, reaching every corner where doubt had lingered. Daniels turned to Richard again, his words deliberate. "You pawned your own jewelry 3 days ago. You accused an innocent woman to cover a debt or a loss you didn't want exposed. Why? Richard's jaw worked silently before words stumbled out. Investments. The market turned. A call came due. It's nothing illegal, nothing criminal. It's the nature of risk. But Ruiz's eyes didn't waver. Then why not admit it? Why not say you used the jewelry for liquidity? Why stage a theft? Why drag your staff, a woman who's worked for you for years, through humiliation? Richard's voice hardened, trying one last time to reclaim control. Because appearances matter. Because people judge weakness. Because if word spread that I pawned jewels, it would be interpreted as failure. Investors are skittish. Reputation is currency. He inhaled sharply, the confession spilling from him without permission. So I built a better story. The hidden truth had been waiting, and now it stood naked in the room. The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that communicates volumes without a sound. Ruiz closed the laptop gently, as though the case had just closed with it. Daniel spoke with finality. You built a lie, and you almost ruined an innocent woman's life to protect it. Sarah's eyes burned, not with tears this time, but with the raw impact of revelation. She lifted her chin, steady now. All these years I thought honesty was my weakness, she said quietly, but it's the only thing that saved me today. James broke the stillness with words he had carried in silence too long. We all knew Sarah wasn't capable of it. We all knew, but no one had the power to say it. Elena's voice trembled but found courage. He made us believe questioning him was betrayal, but the truth doesn't betray. Richard's face flushed with anger and something deeper, fear. You think this changes anything? I still control this house, Daniels cut him off with calm authority. No, what you control is ending. Fraudulent claims, false reports, obstruction, these are not shadows, they're charges, and you'll answer for them. The grandeur of the mansion suddenly felt smaller, the chandeliers dimmer, the polished marble no longer gleaming but cold. Richard's empire of appearances cracked in real time, and everyone in the house felt the impact. It was no longer about a necklace, it was about the mindset that arrogance can rewrite reality, that money can silence truth. That mindset had just collapsed under the weight of evidence. Sarah exhaled deeply, her shoulders lowering as if a burden had finally slipped free. She thought of Ethan and the promise she'd made to herself, to never let him believe she could be broken by lies. Her innocence was intact, and more than that, the hidden truth had revealed a transformation she never expected. She wasn't just the maid accused, she was the woman who stood firm until the lie collapsed around the man who created it. Richard tried once more, his words brittle. You don't understand what's at stake. My name, my investments, my legacy. But Ruiz's eyes stayed steady. Legacies are built on choices, and these were yours. Outside, the sound of another cruiser rolling into the driveway broke the tension, a reminder that revelations don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward, pulling in new witnesses, new consequences, new journeys. The staff shifted quietly, each of them aware that the moment would mark them too, not with shame, but with the impact of watching a lie dissolve in front of them. And in the foyer, Sarah finally let her trembling hands unclench the paper of Ethan's. Drawing now warm from her grip, she looked at it and whispered, "We're going to be all right." The words weren't just for her son, they were for herself, for the part of her that had carried doubt under accusation, and for the truth that had finally found its voice. But even as the revelation settled into the air, the story was not finished. The house still held corners unexplored, details waiting for their turn, and decisions yet to be made. The necklace might have been pawned, but the consequences of Richard's deception were only beginning to take shape, and the mansion seemed to brace itself for the weight of what would come next. The moment the truth settled, it didn't explode. It unfolded, quietly, steadily, like a sheet being pulled across a table to reveal what had always been underneath. The mansion's grand foyer, which had served as a stage for accusation, softened into something human again. Ruiz closed the laptop with a gentle finality. and Daniels spoke to Sarah in a voice that carried both authority and care. "Ms. Miller," he said, "you are not under suspicion. We have sufficient evidence that the items were not stolen from this house. You are cleared." The word didn't echo. It sank in. Cleared. Sarah touched the edge of Ethan's drawing with her thumb, as if to ground the moment, and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding since morning. "Thank you," she said, quiet and deliberate, not to curry favor, but to honor what was real. James straightened, emotion flickering past his careful composure. "Miss Miller," he said, the formality slipping, "we never doubted your character." Elena stepped forward with the kind of tenderness that only people who've weathered long shifts together can offer. "I made coffee," she whispered, as if warmth could repair what humiliation had bruised. Miguel nodded, his voice low. "This house forgets who it stands on." It wasn't a speech. It was the kind of sentence people say when the hidden truth changes their posture. Richard tried to reclaim the room with posture alone, but posture doesn't argue with evidence. The mask he wore had been carved so deep it almost looked like skin, and yet cracks now mapped across it. "This is an overreach," he muttered, forcing a smile that had no anchor. "A misunderstanding blown out of proportion." Daniels remained level. "Sir, you filed a false theft report and attempted to implicate an employee you supervise. You withheld material facts, and you triggered an insurance rider under questionable pretenses. Will be contacting the broker and the district attorney." The line didn't shout. It simply placed the next step on the floor. The iron gate outside whispered again as another cruiser rolled forward. A neighbor's SUV slowed on the street, curiosity hanging just outside the hedge like humidity. Ruiz retrieved the printed logs and the pawn receipt, slid them into a case folder, and looked up at Richard with a gaze that let no one pretend. "You need to understand," she said. "This is not just a lapse of judgment. It's a system of choices, and systems have consequences." He opened his mouth to object, then closed it. The calculation visible, what to admit, what to bury, what to spin. For the first time, spin had nowhere to land. Sarah didn't gloat. Relief, yes, the kind that releases your shoulders and returns your breath, but triumph wasn't the shape of her heart. Gratitude was. "Officer," she asked softly, "may I call my sons?" "School? I need to tell them I'll be there." Daniel's face eased. "Of course." She stepped aside with her phone, the words catching for a moment at her throat before finding their path. "I'm okay," she told the receptionist. "Please tell Ethan his mom is okay. I'm on my way." The sentence did something inside her, stitched a seam that had frayed in the last few hours. Behind the scenes, the legal mechanism began to turn. Ruiz requested that Richard remain on the premises while an evidence team photographed the lockbox and the study console. Daniels radioed dispatch with a calm that suggested this wasn't his first mansion or his first mask. The language shifted, from missing property to fraud investigation, from alleged theft to false reporting, from employee scrutiny to employer liability. Words matter, they draw maps. And this map led away from Sarah. The staff's body language transformed in subtle ways. Heads lifted, backs uncurled. The invisible contract that had kept their eyes down loosened. James moved to Sarah's side in the doorway and spoke in a tone that balanced dignity with apology. "If you want to finish the shift, we'll support you. If you want to go to your son, I'll cover every task myself." She looked at the polished floors, at the chandelier that still glittered like a performance, and then at Ethan's drawing. "I'm going to him," she said. "I think he needs to see my face." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a decision, the kind that shapes a life. More than a job ever could. Richard, sensing the narrative sliding out of his hands, tried to bark orders to no one in particular. "James, call the attorney. Elena, stop loitering and clean the—" He cut himself off when he saw no one scurry, only stand with quiet resolve. Authority without credibility is just volume. The impact of that realization showed in the way his shoulders pulled inward, a small betrayal of a posture he had trained to be permanent. Outside, sunlight draped itself across the front steps, indifferent and generous. Sarah stepped into it like a swimmer surfacing. She called a rideshare, no ceremony, just motion, and watched the magnolia leaves tremble in a soft Sunday breeze. As she waited, a familiar ringtone buzzed. "Mom?" Ethan's voice carried that tight sound kids get when they've been brave too long. "Are you okay? They said you're okay." She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them to a sky that suddenly felt wider. "I'm okay," she said, letting the truth fill the space between them. "I'm coming to you." His breath rushed out. Relief, belief, home. "I knew you didn't do anything," he added, fierce in that way only a child's loyalty can be. "I told Mason at recess. My mum doesn't lie." She laughed, the sound edged with tears she refused to let fall yet. "Keep telling the world who you are," she said. "I'll be there soon." Back in the foyer, Ruiz presented a choice to Richard with the evenness of a professional who has nothing to prove. "You can cooperate voluntarily, provide full statements, consent to device imaging and coordinate with your insurer and counsel, or we can proceed with a formal warrant and take this out of your control." He bristled at the last word more than the rest. Control had been his oxygen. "I'll cooperate," he said, the consonants clipped. "This house will not be treated like a crime scene." Daniels didn't flinch. "Sir, this house has already been treated like a performance. We're correcting the script. Word travels in neighborhoods like Richard's, not in gossip, but in posture." A delivery driver paused at the gate longer than necessary. A jogger slowed and pretended to tie her shoe. The story would become a whisper by evening and a dinner table topic by tomorrow. Public humiliation doesn't always arrive as headlines. Sometimes it arrives as glances, timelines, and investor calls that suddenly reschedule. Reputation is currency until its mint is audited. The car pulled up for Sarah, and she climbed in with the careful grace of someone who refuses to take up less space than she deserves. The driver, sensing the uniforms, said nothing. The city slid by, the brick fronts of Grant Park, the mural near Memorial Drive that always made Ethan point out the blue heron, the life she actually lived instead of the one she cleaned around. She pressed her palm to the folded drawing in her lap. "We're okay," she whispered, not as a wish, but as evidence. At the school, the afternoon light pooled across. The lawn and kids' voices rose in the ordinary music of dismissal. Ethan broke from the line before the teacher could call his name and ran, his backpack thumping against his small frame. He collided into her waist with such fierce certainty that she had to laugh just to keep balance. "You're really okay?" he asked again, tilting his face up. "I'm really okay," she said, pressing her cheek to his hair. The truth showed up. He nodded like a person signing a contract. "I told them," he said. I told them you tell me to be brave and kind and honest, and that means you are too." She kissed his temple. "That's our deal," she said. "Brave, kind, honest." He grinned, dimples deepening. "Can we get ice cream?" She exhaled a small, incredulous yes. "Yes, today we can." Small celebrations matter. They mark a transformation not just of circumstances, but of mindset, the shift from defense to dignity. Meanwhile, the legal road widened. Back at the mansion, an evidence tech photographed the secondary lockbox and swabbed the blue lint. Daniels coordinated with a detective from financial crimes because pawn slips and insurance riders often draw lines that end in account ledgers. Ruiz called the insurance broker who, on speaker, adopted a tone calibrated for risk. "Will suspend the rider pending documentation." In that one sentence lived the practical consequence Richard feared most: leverage evaporating. A junior associate from one of the investor couples texted James an apology, disguised as logistics, asking for clarity about last night's items. Clarity was coming, and clarity has a way of rewriting calendars. By the time Sarah and Ethan reached the small ice cream shop near the park, normal life had already begun to reassert itself. A bell chimed on the door. The cashier's smile didn't carry pity because she didn't know. She simply smiled because a mother and son had walked in on a warm day. "2 scoops, please," Ethan said with ceremony. "1 for being brave, 1 for being honest." Sarah added, smiling, "and one for coming home." They sat near the window. Outside, a martyr bus sighed at the curb. Inside, a couple debated pistachio versus strawberry. Ordinary was a miracle. Still, the day had its shadows. A call from Ruiz reached Sarah's phone as she wiped a napkin across Ethan's mouth. "We'll need your formal statement this afternoon," the officer said. "No rush, just accuracy." Sarah agreed. "I want to make a record of what happened. For him," she replied, glancing at her son, "so he can know how truth works." Ruiz's voice softened. "He already does. But yes, let's make it official." Back at the mansion, the procession of consequences gathered shape. A plain car, not a dramatic one, eased up the drive. A detective in plain clothes entered with purpose. There would be no handcuffs in the foyer yet. The process was measured. Richard's attorney, patched in by phone, urged restraint, then negotiation, then narrative control. But narrative control had left the building with the pawn receipt. What remained was accountability. Daniels explained the immediate steps with that same calm cadence. Statements, documentation requests, potential charges forwarded to the DA. Richard nodded in clipped motions, the look of a man learning that momentum can swing against you faster than you can buy a new story. Word of the morning's events reached the edges of Richard's social circle by late afternoon. A partner called and left a polite message. "That sounded like a winter coat. Let's pause on next week's meeting until you've settled a few things. Pauses like that are not neutral. They are verdicts in polite clothing. Public humiliation doesn't require a camera if the room you live in is built of glass." When Sarah and Ethan walked back into their apartment, the familiar clutter felt like a blessing. Ethan dropped his backpack and held out the napkin-wrapped souvenir, 2 gummy bears he had saved because he thought she might want them. "Later. For you," he said, "because you didn't give up." She crouched and pulled him into a hug that had weight. "Thank you," she said. "I'm proud of you for believing." He looked serious in the way children do when they've carried an adult-sized question all day. "Does the man who lied get in trouble?" She thought for a moment, considering the balance between justice and bitterness. "He will face what he chose," she said. "That's what happens when people make decisions that hurt others. But we don't have to carry him with us." Ethan nodded, absorbing it. "We carry us," he decided. "Yes," she said, smiling, "we carry us." In the quiet that followed, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of paper, the habit of writing steadying her breathing. She wrote down the times she remembered, the rooms she'd cleaned, the hallway she had avoided, the words that had been aimed at her, and the words she chose to say back. Not just for the report, though that mattered, but as a record of mindset, a behind-the-scenes map of courage. She tucked the paper into an envelope, labeled with the day's date, and placed it in a drawer beside old-school pictures and rent receipts. Evidence of a life lived clean. Evening tilted over the city. At the mansion, lights came on by automation, but the glow didn't feel warm. It felt like a set between acts. Ruiz stepped out with her case folder. Daniels finished a call with the DA's office, and a plan formed for the next mornings. Follow-ups, bank records, insurer interviews, a quiet visit to Northside Jewelry and Loan for the Clark statement and surveillance pull. The journey of this case had turned its corner, but steps still needed taking. That's how revelations work. They don't end things. They change the direction in which things continue. As for Richard, the most public part of his humiliation was not the officers, not even the documents. It was the staff's eyes when he walked down the hall. No shouting, no gloating, just the absence of awe. James offered professional courtesy, but not deference. Elena held her head high. Miguel's nod was respectful, not fearful. Power notices when reverence leaves the room. He retreated to his study and shut the door. The click loud in a house that heard everything. Inside, facing a desk that had always obeyed him, he felt for the first time how quiet can press on a person. The watch he wore ticked. Each second admitted that control, once assumed permanent, was subject to audit. Night approached in soft layers. Sarah and Ethan curled on their second-hand couch, a cartoon humming on low just to make sound. She ran her fingers through his hair, and he leaned into the small space that belongs only to mothers and sons who have walked through a storm and decided to be a lighthouse for each other. "Mom?" he asked, eyes heavy. "Tomorrow is normal." She kissed his forehead. "Tomorrow is us," she said. "That's better than normal." And somewhere between the mansion's curated silence and the apartment's honest quiet, the city breathed. Sirens in the distance that meant nothing to them anymore. A neighbor laughing down the hall, a dog barking twice and giving up. Life continued, but not as before. The impact of the day had rearranged center points. Reputation losing its throne, truth taking its seat, dignity restored not by permission, but by proof. The narrative that had been written against Sarah evaporated, and in its place stood a woman who had been tested and did not break. There was still more to do, statements to sign, calls to return, small ripples to manage in circles that had watched but not helped. But the bridge into what came next was already built, not a dramatic one, just a steady span of ordinary decisions that accumulate into transformation. Sarah would return to the station to formalize her account. Ruiz would catalogue the evidence. Daniels would brief the DA, and the light in the upstairs hallway of a certain mansion would travel one more inch toward the top stair, arriving right where the next piece of this story waited to be found. The day eventually folded into night, but the echoes of what had happened lingered far beyond the walls of Richard's mansion. The marble floors that had once been polished to reflect wealth now seemed to reflect something else. Fragility. Power built on illusion had cracked, and in its place the hidden truth had forced its way into the open. The staff moved quietly through the halls, not with the usual nervous urgency, but with a strange new steadiness, as though they no longer carried the invisible weight of one man's dominance on their shoulders. Richard stayed locked in his study, the door a flimsy barrier against consequences that had already slipped past. Sarah, in contrast, found herself surrounded by warmth that no chandelier could produce. Sitting with Ethan at their modest kitchen table, she noticed how different the air felt. It wasn't that the apartment had changed. It was still small, still cluttered, still marked by second-hand furniture, but her sense of it had shifted. Survival had been her daily rhythm, but now dignity had become her rhythm, a reminder that truth is not fragile even when people are. Ethan's voice anchored her in this reality. "Mom," he said, tracing his finger along the rim of his glass, "when people lie about you, it hurts, but when the truth comes out, it makes you stronger, doesn't it?" She smiled, brushing her hand across his hair. "Yes," she answered. "It hurts first, but it builds something in you, and what it builds can't be taken away." That was the lesson living quietly inside the day. Transformation does not always come in grand gestures or perfect victories. It often comes through small, painful moments that demand a choice. Sarah could have collapsed under accusation, could have allowed Richard's arrogance to define her. Instead, she chose stillness, honesty, and the mindset of someone who understands that dignity isn't granted by others. It's carried from within. Richard, on the other hand, chose deception, fueled by greed and fear of exposure. His decisions were guided not by truth, but by the desperate preservation of an image. And those decisions carried their own consequences. The impact of the revelation stretched beyond Sarah's apartment and Richard's study. For the staff who had watched silently for years, it was proof that power isn't permanent when it is rooted in lies. For the officers, it was another reminder that even in the grandest of houses, injustice often tries to hide in plain sight. And for Sarah's son, it became a defining story, one he would carry into adulthood, that humility is not weakness, and that truth, no matter how delayed, has a way of breaking through arrogance. In the days that followed, Richard's name surfaced in conversations not for his wealth, but for his exposure. Investors withdrew. Friends who had once dined under his chandeliers avoided his calls. His empire, built On appearances faced cracks deeper than financial ones. It faced the unraveling of reputation. He had tried to disguise his own failures by silencing an innocent voice, but arrogance has a way of becoming its own witness. His downfall wasn't just legal, it was moral, and everyone who had seen the drama unfold understood that. For Sarah, life moved forward, not in headlines, but in small victories. She walked Ethan to school with a lighter step, no longer shadowed by shame. She applied for work at a different household, where her story preceded her, not as scandal but as testimony. People who had once looked past her now looked at her with respect. She didn't ask for admiration. She simply continued her journey with the same honesty she always had. Yet her resilience spoke louder than any accusation ever could. Behind the scenes of this story, the real transformation wasn't in Richard's downfall, but in Sarah's quiet triumph. She reminded those who watched that humility, though often overlooked, is stronger than arrogance because it cannot be shaken by exposure. Arrogance crumbles when light hits it. Humility shines brighter, and justice, though sometimes delayed by the noise of power, always finds its way to the surface. In a world where power often silences the innocent, Daniels had said later in his report, truth eventually speaks, no matter how many walls are built against it. Those words carried more than procedural weight. They carried wisdom born from countless cases where arrogance had tried to bury honesty. Ethan, with a child's clarity, had put it more simply, "You told the truth, Mom. That's why we won." And perhaps that was the most profound reflection of all. The story was no longer just about a millionaire and his maid. It was about the universal clash between pride and humility, between illusion and reality, between the noise of false accusations and the quiet persistence of truth. It showed that even in the sharpest contrasts, wealth against poverty, arrogance against dignity, the moral balance eventually tips, not always quickly, not always easily, but inevitably. And so the lesson settles, not as a moral imposed from outside, but as something felt deep inside the heart. Humility is stronger than arrogance. Lies collapse under the weight of their own fabrication, and justice, even when delayed, always finds its way forward. The mansion in Atlanta may return to silence, its chandeliers still glittering above empty halls, but those who were there will remember that morning, as the day truth walked through the front door, uninvited, and sat down where arrogance once ruled. And Sarah, holding Ethan's hand as they stepped into the ordinary rhythm of life, carried not bitterness, but strength, proof that innocence, though tested, can outlast the storm. The journey was not over. The legal process would continue, with paperwork, hearings, and consequences. But for Sarah, the greater part of the journey had already reached its turning point. She had walked through accusation and emerged with her dignity intact. That was the real victory, one that couldn't be measured in wealth, but in resilience, in mindset, in the transformation that happens when truth survives the fire of injustice. And somewhere in that truth lies the quiet reminder that in every battle between power and humility, the scales may tilt wildly at first, but they always return to balance, always. And if you've stayed with me until this point, I imagine this story stirred something in you too. Maybe it reminded you of a time when truth finally surfaced, or maybe it gave you the reassurance that dignity can outlast even the harshest trials. If it did, leave me a note in the comments with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you walked through this journey right alongside me. And while you're here, a simple like on this video helps these kinds of stories travel further, reaching others who might need the same reminder today. If the way we explored this touched you, consider subscribing. It's how you'll keep walking with me through the next stories of resilience, hidden truths, and unexpected transformations. Speaking of which, there's another video waiting for you right here. It connects beautifully with what we've just shared, so click and continue with me there.